The nationwide Nabisco strike came to an end this week after more than 75% of union members voted in favor of a new contract that was offered by executives at Nabisco's parent company, Mondelez. Now, the agreement came after workers across the country decided to strike in protest of a long list of pretty awful proposals in contract negotiations, including cuts in benefits and in overtime pay.
The showdown is something that's been brewing for years, with workers asking to give more and more concessions, culminating in contract talks that were the final straw for many. The new contract offered by Mondelez would ditch their longstanding premium pay system, which guarantees time and a half for anyone working more than 8 hours a day and on Saturdays, and gives double pay for working Sundays. It was one of the main attractions for the job, which can often take a huge physical toll on workers. Instead of time and a half, workers would be paid normal wages until they hit 40 hours each week, regardless of the days in which they work. The company also wants to change 8-hour workdays to 12-hour shifts, something workers aren't thrilled about, considering that some of them have worked for months without a single day off. But some estimates reveal the cuts could cost workers between $10,000 and $40,000 a year, as Mondelez earned $3.5 billion in profit in 2020.
So that's a good rundown of all of the awful proposals that the parent company was making for these workers. They hated it, and they decided to strike. And luckily, that strike did allow these workers to secure some critical concessions. And I want to share those concessions with you. Now, this is also important. Though some Portland employees opposed ratifying the 4-year contract, calling for better terms, it ultimately garnered the necessary support from workers there and at facilities in Aurora, Colorado, Richmond, Virginia, Chicago, Illinois, and Norcross, Georgia. Now, the new contract for the Nabisco workers, scraps the new healthcare proposal, which would obviously provide worse healthcare than they currently had or currently have. So they were able to continue with the healthcare policies that they liked. It also increases wages by 60 cents an hour. It includes a one-time $5,000 bonus, and it also allows most workers to maintain their regular overtime schedules. Now, why did some of the employees want to reject the negotiations, reject this deal? Well, one of the main areas of conflict, as mentioned earlier, was the mandatory overtime. And Nabisco was, in fact, forcing workers to work overtime even when they didn't want to. If they refused it, they would be retaliated against. Now, due to the COVID-related labor shortage, employees, including those at Nabisco, have been, forcing workers to work these grueling hours and these back-to-back shifts. Some of the workers said that all they had time to do was sleep for 8 hours before having to get back to work the next day. And to add insult to injury, Mondelez International actually tried to limit overtime pay. Mondelez wanted some Nabisco employees to work for shifts of up to 12 hours without even being eligible for overtime pay, in exchange for working fewer days a week. By the way, this is a trick that employers have tried to implement for a very, very long time, following some of the successes of the labor movement. We'll get to that in just a second. But those on weekend shifts, previously eligible for extra pay, would get the premium only after working 40 hours a week. Now, the way it works now is if you work longer than an 8-hour shift, you get a time and a half for every hour past that 8 hours. And Mondelez wanted to get rid of that. And it was incredibly frustrating for the workers, not only because of the pay situation, which again adds insult to injury, but because these workers were already so overworked. Watch.
We have a family just as well as the people in human resources and management. While we're working on the weekend and being forced, they're at home with their families. We can't even get a chance to enjoy birthday parties for our grandkids. We can't go away to take our kids to college because we're being forced to work. We can't enjoy our husbands, our spouses, because we're at work. By the time we get off work, it's go home, go to sleep, try to fix us something to eat, get in the bed, and be back at work.
And when they say, oh, I want to change your hours, I want to take it away, your premium time, I want to cut your health insurance, they're not loyal to it.
They're not loyal. Now, look, the employers are going to want to maximize profit, and that means squeezing as much labor out of these workers at the lowest possible price. And I'm sad to report that even though there were critical concessions on behalf of the workers, the mandatory overtime pay issue continues to be a problem, which is why some of the workers were against this deal. So, More Perfect Union updated everyone on Twitter about the outcome of the negotiations. The new agreement doesn't kill Mondelez's plan to implement 12-hour weekend shifts with no overtime pay, but that system would mostly apply to new workers who take weekend crew roles. Now, with votes in from all 5 US bakeries, support for the deal was overwhelming, we were told. And as I mentioned earlier, 75% of the workers agreed to the deal. So obviously, the majority of workers wanted this. Now, I also want to just note that in order for this new policy to be implemented, meaning that it would only impact new workers, they would need to hire new workers. And despite the fact that the federally subsidized unemployment benefits have expired, which many thought would force people back to work, the truth of the matter is employers are still having a difficult time finding labor. I think childcare probably has a lot to do with that, as Nando, gave us a lot of details on in a previous Decode segment. Now, I do also want to talk about the issue of mandatory overtime, because this is a problem that impacts many workers across the country, not just unionized workers who have some protection, who are able to do what the Nabisco workers did, but usually workers who don't have much protection at all and could really be retaliated against if they speak out against this type of abuse. Now, as Stanford University economist Nicholas Bloom notes, America's gross domestic product, a measure of how the economy is performing, is actually back to pre-pandemic levels. He says that the GDP is miraculously above its pre-pandemic levels, but we have 5 or 6 million less employees. So each person is generating more output. This will involve working harder per hour, so less breaks, more intensity, and more stress, and also more hours. And just to give you an idea of how bad the situation really is, the number of open US positions surged to a record 10.9 million in July, the most recent month for which government data is available. Now, instead of offering improved working conditions and higher wages, companies that are actually the most impacted by these labor shortages are actually demanding that their remaining workers carry the burden by working mandatory overtime. So in a survey conducted by Payroll ADP Inc., US workers reported putting in an average of 8.9 hours a week of unpaid time in January of 2021, compared with 4 hours a week a year earlier. The survey didn't specify what share of those workers are eligible for premium pay. Now, when you take a look at specific sectors, for instance, the manufacturing world, production employees worked an average of 4.2 extra hours a week last month, and that's according to data from the Labor Department. That was up from an average of 3.8 extra hours in August of 2020 and 2.8 hours in April of 2020. And I want to give you an example of a forklift driver who luckily does get a time and a half for overtime work. That's good news. Not everyone gets that, unfortunately. His name is Jose Ramos, and he was speaking to the the Wall Street Journal, to talk about how, oftentimes he will volunteer for overtime because he does get the extra pay associated with it, but sometimes he's forced to do it by his employer. So Jose Ramos, a forklift operator for glass and metal producer Ardagh Group in Indiana, who said he worked more than 600 hours of overtime last quarter and still often puts in 72-hour weeks. Now, Ramos's managers often ask for 2 or 3 overtime volunteers. If not enough people raise their hands, workers who incurred the fewest overtime hours that week are required to step up, he said. Refusing the request can lead to a write-up. So there is retaliation if these workers say no, they reject the mandatory overtime. And that is incredibly difficult when you consider the fact that workers have lives outside of the workplace. They have families to take care of, kids to drop off at school, kids to pick up from soccer games, that kind of stuff. And as you know, what compounds this situation is the fact that we don't have childcare. There really isn't a system in place in the United States that offers families the support necessary so there's childcare while the parents are at work. And then there are some pretty extreme examples. RK Industries, LLC, a 1,400-person construction and manufacturing firm based in Denver, is using overtime to add the equivalent of 60 to 100 full-time employees to its capacity every week. That's around 2,500 hours, or 7.3% of all hours worked. And the grueling hours seem to be keeping potential new hires away, despite this company actually offering some significant pay increases. So they increased their hourly wage from 12 hours to from $12 an hour to $16 an hour. And they're actually planning on increasing wages to $18 an hour. But it's not just about pay. It's about having a life outside of work. So what seems to be keeping a lot of these workers away, but more importantly, why a lot of the workers at RK Industries keep resigning, is because the hours are just untenable. It's incredibly difficult to work long hours, shift after shift, day after day, with really no break in sight. Employers and researchers say that the demands for extra time are contributing to a broad wave of resignations sweeping across the country as more U.S. workers quit their jobs than at any time in the last 2 decades. That in turn places even more pressure on remaining employees. And again, uncompensated overtime is something that businesses are actually fighting hard to implement. But when it comes to salaried workers, people who don't get paid by the hour, that abusive practice has already been in effect for quite some time. But that wasn't always the case. So in 1975, more than 65% of salaried American workers earned time and a half pay for every hour worked over 40 hours a week. Not because capitalists back then were more generous, but because it was the law. And let me note, it wasn't magically the law because members of Congress decided to pass it out of the kindness of their own hearts. That was because there was a more robust labor movement that fought and won, things like the 8-hour work week, 8-hour work day, 40-hour work week, and what have you. We'll get to all of that in just a second. But things changed, obviously. Now, only workers earning an annual income of under $23,660 qualify for mandatory overtime. By 2013, just 11% of salaried workers qualified for overtime pay. To get the country back to the same equitable standards we had in 1975, the Department of Labor would simply have to raise the overtime threshold to $69,000. By the way, this is an older article. It's from 2014. So adjusted for inflation, that number would need to be even higher. But back in 2014, it would have to be $69,000 or less for you to be paid overtime, in the same way that salaried workers would be paid overtime back in 1975. So that's a lot of numbers, okay? And Obama tried, he attempted to do something about salaried workers being overworked and underpaid. And so he wanted to raise that threshold to not quite $69,000. In typical Obama fashion, he wanted to go halfway. Let's watch.
An estimated 10 million workers stand to benefit from the president's plan, including supervisors at fast food restaurants, department store managers, and computer technicians. Right now, under federal law, businesses can deny overtime wages, that's time and a half, to any manager or supervisor who earns more than $455 a week or $23,600 per year. That salary is slightly above the poverty line for a family of 4. President Obama will raise that threshold above $455 to anywhere between $550 and $970 per week.
Now, some progress is certainly better than no progress at all, but unfortunately, Obama waited till the tail end of his second term to try to implement these changes. And the Labor Department, of course, implemented it. And then since Obama was a lame duck president, federal judges were effective in essentially blocking his overtime pay expansion.
21 states got together and sued the Obama administration over the rule. The states argue that the new cap, which would automatically update every 3 years, could deplete their budgets and resources over time. Prior to the nationwide block, Politico reported Republicans in Congress were looking to potentially repeal the overtime rule after President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated.
And by the way, after the federal courts blocked the new labor law, or labor rules, I should say, the Trump administration actually repealed them altogether. Senator Sherrod Brown actually blasted Trump for the move on the Senate floor. Let's watch that.
So when we passed that rule, when the Obama administration sent the Secretary of Labor to Columbus, Ohio, and I was there and we made this announcement, we celebrated on behalf of 150,000 Ohio workers that were making 30 or 40 or 45 up to 46,000 a year, that they were going to get time and a half. If they were away from their family for those extra 10 hours, working 50 hours a week, or those extra 20 hours, if they were working 60 hours a week, they were going to take home thousands of dollars in overtime pay if they did that week after week. This president says he's for workers, and then he changes this law. He changes this rule.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it wouldn't be so surprising if people paid close attention to who Donald Trump was. In fact, you can tell who Donald Trump is and the way he really feels about working Americans based on the way he treats his own workers.
President Trump's personal driver for 25 years is suing his former boss for unpaid overtime. Noel Cintron says he's owed 3,300 hours in back pay for the past 6 years by the Trump organization. Cintron claims he was required to be on duty at 7 a.m. every day and worked as long as 55 hours per week. He also claims he was only given a raise twice in 15 years, and the second one came with a catch. He was told he'd have to surrender his health insurance to get it, a move that saved Trump about $17,886 per year in premiums, according to the lawsuit.
Look, financial interests obligate employers to squeeze as much labor from workers for the lowest possible price. That's what's happening here, right? They want to maximize their profits. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it is the logical and rational thing to do, especially under this type of system. So as unjust as all of this is, there is actually some pretty good news. Workers don't even have to reinvent the wheel, since shorter working days were once fought for and won by organized workers.
Let's go back to the tail end of the Depression. A huge public movement, coupled with the landslide re-election of Franklin Roosevelt, led to the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938.
We had workers, we had the government, and we had the general public who understood the importance of workers' rights. And that established the 40-hour work week. It established the minimum wage as well as the minimum age. And then, of course, the overtime.
Overtime was a game changer for workers who qualified for it.
And so the idea is that workers, like other human beings, want to have a life outside of work, and therefore there should be a limit on what is a norm for work.
What was normal was up for debate. President Roosevelt and Congress settled on the system that we know now. 40 hours is normal. You get 1.5 times your hourly wage for any work beyond that. That created the 8-hour day.
So today's workers can certainly take a page out of the book of organized labor in the past. And really, it's the only way to claw back the gains that previous labor struggles were able to secure. I know we look a lot to electoral politics and just assume that our elected officials are going to do the right thing, or that maybe employers will be moral and not exploit their workers. But none of that is true. Really, it's about power. It's about the power imbalance that we're experiencing right now between the worker and the employer. And we need to organize in order to get that power dynamic back to where it belongs.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.